Mornings, Jane doesn't, she always asks me, do you have any songs? And I say, nah, whatever you want. Today I picked a few, the first three there, first two there, and then she picked the next one, which really touches me too. I don't know if any of you ever watched PBS, but last night on the Gaither show, they had, I don't know their last name. Feek. Joey and Rory Feek, they're musicians, and she died of cancer. And the day before she found out that her cancer was terminal and they wouldn't do anything else with it, she had an interview with Bill Gaither. And she made a song, or a CD of hymns. And Precious Lord was one of them. It's really good to watch, and we've got the CD. It's an excellent CD. Today we're going to talk about faith. And specifically Hebrews 11, 1 through 3. I'm going to talk about how it says, now faith. That's how it starts out. Those are the first two words in Hebrews 11. Because he talks about it beforehand, the writer of Hebrews talks about it beforehand, but then he goes into now faith and talks about that. And I think that's something that we need to really look at deeply in our own society, in our own lives, in our church. What is faith? Faith goes beyond belief. Belief is easy. Faith is hard. Faith is something that as we're about to see, says faith is in the unseen. That's what makes it hard. At noon, if you walk outside having faith that the sun's going to shine is not a big deal because it's right in front of you. You can see it. Faith would be overnight saying, I know the sun's going to come up tomorrow. That's faith. We all have faith in something. Everybody has faith in something. They believe in something. If you're not driving my truck right now, when you go out of church here and you turn the key, you have faith that it'll start. If you're driving my truck, it doesn't work. But everyone has some sort of faith. Even atheists have faith. They just believe that they're right. Their faith is that they're right. Their faith is in science or something else. They try to explain things away with theories and all sorts of other things where there's no fact to it. It's just another guess. But their faith is in man and not in God. Right. We're different. We should be different. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Before we get into that, let's just go to the Lord in prayer as we start this time of learning. Father God, I thank you that we're here and able to get into your word today, Lord. I thank you that your word is laid out before us and that you guide us and direct us in every day of our lives. You never leave us alone and you're always with us and that you're with us here now. And Father, I just ask that you give me the words that you want spoken and you soften our hearts and our ears. Help this to be something, Lord, that we can take into ourselves. I ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. So we're just going to read right off the top. I'm going to read page 1 through 3, and then we'll go through them a little bit more verse by verse. But Hebrews 11, 1 through 3 says, now faith is confidence in what we hope for, and assurance about what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. By faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. That's quite a statement there. This last little part I really like, and I didn't really get into 3 all that much, but this understanding that God created the universe from nothing. That is the one thing that man can't ever claim to have done. We have never created matter from nothing, no matter. All the scientists in the world cannot explain that concept. Everything has to come from something else. They can't say where it originated. No matter what their theories are, they can't get to that. I teach history. I teach geography. We go into archaeology. We talk about a lot of these things, and everything's a theory. Evolution is a theory. It's not a law. It's not a rule. And yet people will treat it like that. But we know, because the Bible tells us, that God created the heavens and the earth. He took nothing and made matter out of it. He took nothing and made you out of it. Without God, none of us is possible. And I laugh when I hear someone who's a scientific atheist that says, well, that's all fairy tales. And I say, okay, if that's all fairy tales, then you treat it like a child. And you say, why? And you just keep asking why. Eventually they'll get frustrated and tell you that you're ignorant and let you go. Well, if my stuff is fairy tales, then where did this come from? What are the odds of this happening? How do we get to where we are now? This is 100% accident as it goes along. We watched a show on Nova the other night about Jupiter. Beautiful planet. We sent a bunch of space probes out there and they videotaped them. The hydrogen gas clouds are 1,000 miles deep and it's just swirling over the top. It's really cool and you're seeing all these things really cool, and then they're explaining about how Jupiter caused this to happen and that to happen and all these things, and I'm thinking, oh, that was all God. Because Jupiter went in and then Jupiter came back out, and it kind of did a hokey pokey thing that stars made all the other planets go where they were supposed to, and yeah, that's an accident, sure, that's what that was. Our faith has to be deeper than that. And our faith has to go to the point where we believe in what is unseen. Pete? Because unseen faith is the basis for our hope. Go ahead, Pete. Habakkuk 2:4 says, see, the enemy is puffed up. His desires are not upright, but the righteous person will live by his faithfulness. The righteous person will live by his faithfulness, not by your belief, not by your bumper sticker, not by your affiliation, not by what your parents did, not by what your kids are doing. You have to live by faith yourself. Faithfulness. Full, not faith partialness. You are or you aren't. You're hot or cold. If you're hot, you're faithful. This passage right here is so important because our faith in Jesus Christ is based on what is unseen, is it not? Mm-hmm. Now we know that there were authors that saw what happened with Jesus. They saw him after the resurrection. They heard his words. They walked with him. We were not there. As old as I am, I was not there. But someone was, and they wrote it down. And Jesus said, I'm coming back. And the men that heard that with their own ears did not see that. But they lived in faith every day that it would happen. They didn't get a chance to experience it, but they lived in faith. We are the same way. Without seeing that, without being there, without first-hand knowledge. Personally, I think Thomas gets kind of a short stick. Old doubting Thomas in the Bible, the disciple that said, if I put my hand there myself, man, that guy's got that name for life. Doubting Thomas. One incident. After that, I bet he never doubted again. Our faith has to be strong enough that we go with the unseen. We don't need to see it. We don't just say, show me what God's done, because we believe. Because my faith tells me that I've seen God in my life, and I know it's going to keep going. I've seen God in the past. I know I'll see God in the future. God's hand has been on my life all the way along. I may have told this story before, and if I have, forgive me, but when we were adopting Maggie, we went through a long process, including going over and meeting her and spending time with her. And then all the legal stuff has to go on. And the Bulgarian legal court has to do all theirs, and the U.S. was actually not bad, but the Bulgarian side, they were going through this and that and all these different things, and we paying them fees and all these things. And it gets all the way up to the top of their government. And their head of their health ministry, I believe, looked at our home study and saw that we had Hawken and said, no, that's too much. People shouldn't have to have 2 disabled kids. We got notified by the lawyer that day. That was crushing, because I'd already met her. I'd held her in my arms. She was mine. We're going to go get her. That just absolutely crushed us. And we prayed about it. We prayed hard about it. We cried about it. It was a tough thing. And God, in his infinite wisdom, then said, okay, I'll do this then. We had a friend that Jane knew when we met. He was actually in Somalia with us when we met. He was a chaplain in the Army. Toughest chaplain you'll ever meet. This guy was a bug-eating chaplain. He was one of those really cool ones, you know. He was the Army guy that was also a chaplain. Somebody you really look up to. Poor guy was named Chester by his parents, but that wasn't his fault. Chester, in his tours in the Army, one of the times he spent was as the chaplain to the embassy. He had a connection with Bulgaria. Who'd have thunk it? We knew a guy that had that's an odd deal. he talked to the Bulgarian ambassador who said, or the U.S. ambassador to Bulgaria, who talked to the Bulgarian ambassador to the U.S., and they said, well, of course, this makes sense. Of course they should adopt her. And that happened within days of the world shutting the door and God opening it back up again. And that's just one instance of faith that we have gotten, that has been revealed to us, God's hand revealed to us in our lives. In the simple everyday things we see it, but also in big moments in our lives. And I think every one of us can look back in our lives and see those big explosions of God in our life. Times when this is not possible, God makes it possible. Times when this shouldn't happen, God makes it happen. A lot of those things have come along. A lot of times when the world would say, okay, now's your chance to give up on faith. Boom, there it goes. Watching that young woman, that singer last night, when she was talking about she had cancer, it went away, it came back. She'd been through chemo and radiation several times. They were talking about going back for radiation again. She had a sense of kind of the end of her days. Had a little one, had a little Down syndrome baby with her that they just had not that long before she found out she was sick again. And she was so at peace with that. She said, I just feel for people that don't get to go with me. Because she had so much faith that God wouldn't heal her, but God has her. That God accepts her. And that's the hope that's talked about here. That's the hope that's talked about in Hebrews 11:1. That hope of what we don't see in front of us. The righteous will live by faith was such an important statement. That piece from Habakkuk, which is not a well-known book in the Bible. That's the one when little guys, we get them to memorize the books of the Bible. Habakkuk kind of slips on their tongues because they get da-da-da-da-da-da, and Habakkuk is one of those weird ones, right? But this passage about living by faith was so important. It was mentioned in the New Testament several times. 2 times I'm going to bring up here. First one was in Hebrews 10, right before where we're doing now. It says, but my righteous one will live by faith, and I take no pleasure in the one who shrinks back. Oh, not only will the righteous live by faith, but God says, and if you don't, I take no pleasure in that at all. The second one is Paul's letter to the Romans. He says, for in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith first to last. Just as it is written, the righteousness will live by faith. In the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed. In the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed. And then it says, the righteous will live by faith. If we understand who God is, what He is, who we are, if we understand that whole relationship, that's the righteousness of God. God is completely holy. There is nothing that we could ever hold against God. He is perfect, He is holy, He is before, He is after, He is the beginning, He's the end, He's all of it.
Amen.
God's timing is not our timing. That's because God has no time, because God is time. God has everything. If we understand that, and the gospel lays that out for us so clearly, Jesus laid that out in His own lifetime. That is all laid out for us. If we understand that and accept that and believe in that, and then live by faith, that's when God is pleased with us. Because if He shrinks, He takes no pleasure in those who shrinks back, then the converse, going back to the Greek rhetoric, is if you don't shrink from it, God is pleased. And that's how we do that. Now, Hebrews 11:2 says, this is what the ancients were commended for. And I could do a 3.5 hour sermon here if I read all 40 verses of Hebrews 11, because it's really good. It's the Old Testament. It's the Old Testament from Abel all the way through the prophets. And he goes through and gives examples. The writer of Hebrews goes through and gives example after example after example of faith here. But I know my wife would be a little upset with me, so I'm not going to go that far. But I do want to bring up a little bit here. Okay? He starts off in Hebrews 11, and he goes through Abel, Enoch, Noah, and then Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, So he goes to Abraham and then follows the line down. We get to Moses. He talks about a lot more than that. He talks about all these people, specifically about their faithfulness. Now, the interesting thing with Abel was, for me, as I thought about this, I thought, yeah, Abel was the first martyr for his faithfulness to God. Think about that. Abel was killed by his brother because his sacrifice was acceptable to God. The very first one. All the way through the prophets. It goes through all these things. As a matter of fact, even the writer of Hebrews eventually says, in 32, he says, "What more shall I say? I do not have the time to tell about Gideon, Samson, Barak, Jephthah, David, and Samuel, and the prophets." Even he, when he wrote this letter, said, "I don't even have time to go through it all." He went through all these initially here, but then he said, "But I can't even follow all of them, because every one of them lays out the same thing. They lived by faith. They walked by faith." I get discouraged sometimes when I hear people say, "Well, the Old Testament is just a bunch of stories. We don't have to worry about the Old Testament. It's all the New Testament." Wow. What are you saying? God laid out examples for us of the Old Testament. He showed us His power. He showed us everything. As He walked through all these things, God laid it out for us. So when in Hebrews He says, this is what the ancients were commended for, that's what He's talking about. Live like they lived. Walk in faith like they walked in faith. I'm going to talk about just a couple of them here. Specifically. Oh. Let me go to this first. Stay there, Pete. Go back. Matthew 23:35. These are Jesus' words. "And so upon you will come all the righteous blood that has been shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zacharias, son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar." If we are not walking in faith the way they walked in faith, then we are shrinking from it. And what did that say? We're shrinking from it. God is not pleased with us. So, upon us all will come this blood. Without Jesus Christ, without our faith in God, without the true walking in faith that we are supposed to have, all of that blood falls on us. The day will come. Hebrews 11:13-16 says, "All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised, they only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth." People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had the opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for He has prepared a city for them. This is the talk of the ancients here. This is what the writer of Hebrews is laying down. He's saying, hey, look at all the examples we have of the faith that we're supposed to have. They never stepped away from it. They never walked away from it. Think about that concept again. It's just like the disciples in the New Testament church. Okay? Jesus said, "I'm coming back." He says, "I'm coming back soon." And they lived their lifetime and they died. Many of them were martyred. And their children picked it up from there. And then they died. And there was time after time after time when they thought, Jesus is coming soon, where is He? But they didn't walk away from it. Right up to the day we are today, there's a foundation of people behind us that brought us to faith, that were walking with God, that were in step with God, that their faith was so strong that they could bring us to God. And all of that, like a family tree, we could trace back in genealogy to the Old Testament, all the way through. Faith is walking with God. That's why I chose In the Garden. I love that song. In the garden. He walks with me and He talks with me. And while we think of how wonderful heaven will be when that'll be a physical reality for us, right now, it still is a reality for us. I come to the garden alone when the dew is still on the roses. Spending that time with God. Walking with God. And there's a reason that song was written that way. And some of it goes back to these ancestors we're talking about here. Genesis 5:22. Enoch. After he became the father of Methuselah, Enoch walked faithfully with God for 300 years and had other sons and daughters. Enoch was very special. Most of you know this. You go in the Old Testament, Enoch was very special. The Bible says he never died. God just took him. He lived his life walking faithfully with God. He walked faithfully. So while he was a faithful man, this concept of walking faithfully comes up again. Genesis 6:9 says, Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked faithfully with God. Boy, we got a reappearing theme going on here about these people that Hebrews was talking about. When he talked about walking faithfully with God, what does that mean? What does it mean to walk faithfully with God? When Levi's getting carried by Grandpa, does he worry about falling? Because even if he does, what does Grandpa do? Grandpa lands on his back with Levi on top. He's got all that cushion. Life's good. Okay? Don't talk about the size of the cushion, just this cushion. That happens. That happens in children. They have that faith. That blind faith that whatever you're doing, it's good for them and they'll follow you. That's why Jesus said, if you have the faith of a child, you'll get this. Just follow me. Walk with me. That's what the disciples were blessed with. Until he went into Jerusalem, if Jesus was on land, it never mentioned him ever doing anything but walking. All he did was walk. And they walked with him. Miles upon miles upon miles of walking. And if you've ever been on a long walk with somebody, you have a chance to have some really good talks. That's a really good time to share your heart. Walking with someone. So we need to be walking with him in the same way. Walking means time. They walked with God. They spent time with God. Our life should be filled with that too. Hebrews 5:14. But solid food is for the mature, who by constant use have trained themselves to distinguish good from evil. Constant use. We want to have a childlike faith, but we don't want to ever be treated like children. Our children don't want to be treated like children, especially in teenage years. They want to say, I'm not a child anymore. We are children of God, but we don't want to be children. We think we're better. We're more mature than that. And God says, yeah, that's right. You can be more mature than that. By constant use and training, then you become mature. Then you can distinguish good from evil. Then you will understand what's going on. Until then, so our walking with God has to include this constant training, constant use, constantly being in the Word. You want to be faithful? You get in the Word. You want to be faithful to somebody? Spend time with them. I had a job when I was in the Army, the last one that I had there. I was doing counter-drug operations in South America. And my unit was broken down into different teams, and each team had different countries. I was in Venezuela, there was other ones that were in Colombia, there were some that were in Ecuador, there were all sorts of places. We had a whole crew that went to the Caribbean, which I thought they kind of lucked out. They got to rotate in and out of, the Bahamas. The rest of us are going other places, but there was something that happened fairly regularly, and it's a sad thing. We had married men that got deployed, that got divorced when they came back. That distance, that separation wasn't healed up. It didn't come back together. We had married men or single men that would go down to South America. The Colombian team was notorious for this. It never happened on my team when I was there, but they would marry a Colombian woman, go through all the hoops and all the jumps, bring her back to the U.S., and then they get deployed back to Colombia. Well, by that time, the wife they brought back to the U.S. had enough of that, and they lost their wife. That distance, that separation, that time they weren't spending together, that continual contact wasn't there. And when that happens, it puts a lot of strain on that. It puts a lot of strain on human relationships when we have distance. if we're not spending time talking to each other, we're not spending time working with each other, if we're not spending time walking together, we're going to lose some of that relationship. And God says, walk faithfully. That's constantly. Be constantly in contact. So we should be walking in our faith. Without faith, we can't please God. We already saw that. It already said that. If we shrink from our faith, we won't be close to God. Hebrews 11:6 says, and without faith it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. That was all the patriarchs again. They believed not only that he existed, but that he had good for us. It's not enough to believe that he exists. There's not enough. That is not faith. You can believe and not have faith. Faith is hoping for what's going to happen in the future and the trust that God has this. He has my life, he has my death, he has my eternity in his hands. That's faith. Oh, there's a higher power. That's not faith. That's just acknowledgement. That's not the same thing. If someone says that to you, they are not a faithful person. They're just someone who looks at what is seen and says, I can't deny that something must have happened. Faith goes a lot deeper than that. Without faith, we are never going to be able to please God. In James 2, it says, you believe that there is one God. Good. Good for you. Even the demons believe that and shudder. The demons acknowledge that Jesus exists, but they're not faithful to him. So, if belief is all you need, I believe that he exists, that would work for them. It doesn't. Faithfulness has to come from a deeper place, a stronger place than that.
That's right.
The time is going to come when everyone will run out of time. There's a clock. It is ticking. There's a countdown. It's going on right now. You know, I've heard people talk about, oh, a woman's biological clock ticking. You know, I'm going to have a child. I got to do now all those things. If you're going to believe in God and you're going to walk faithfully with him, the time is now. That clock is ticking. Go ahead, Pete. Matthew 24:30. This is Jesus himself saying, then will appear the Son of Man in heaven, the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then all the people of the earth will mourn when they see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. If you don't believe in the unseen, the seen is going to scare you to death. That's what Jesus is saying. Those that don't believe, they're going to be the ones that are mourning and screaming in fear because they missed it. When that happens, that's the alarm clock buzzing. That's it. You're done. I gave you right up until this moment in time, and it didn't happen. And those people, when they finally do see it with their own eyes, it's going to scare them to death. But guess what? That's not something scary to us that believe. Those of us that are faithful and that are true in our faith, that doesn't scare us. That's a time of celebration. Jesus has returned. Everything will be set right. All the pain and the suffering and the sin and all the terrible things that go on in this earth will be gone completely and never return. That is what we believe. That's the hope. But that's the unseen hope. When this happens, if all it is seeing, you miss the boat. And missing the boat is kind of what Hebrews was talking about in the first couple of verses too, when he gets into Noah. And he talks about how Noah walked with God. But think about that. Noah walked with God. He lived in a desert environment. God said, build me a boat. 450 feet long. Build me a boat. And Noah said, okay, I'll build a boat. Imagine that. There's no water. And it takes him years and years and years. And he walks with God while he does it. It's not a God talked to him once and it was over sort of thing. He was walking with God. He was communing with God every day. He was spending his time with God and doing what God asked him to do. He was walking faithfully. But just like in Noah's day, There was one door into that ark. Only one. For us, just like the ark, Jesus is that one door. John 14:6, Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. And we know from the Old Testament stories that there was one door into the ark, and 2 by 2 the animals marched in there, plus the extra domestic animals, and all those things happened. God saved 7 people outside of Moses, or Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, and their 3 wives. But Noah never shut the door. If you read Noah in Genesis, Noah did not shut the door. God shut the door. And when it shut, it was not opened again. It was over. Well, right now, we have the opportunity. We live in a wonderful time because we are seeing all these things coming to pass. We do have the Word beginning to end, all the way through the revelation of John when he was talking about what's going to happen in our future. We had all those things. In the Old Testament, in the later parts of the Old Testament, they had the prophets talking about things, but we see it all clearly now because we can compare the prophets of the Old Testament and the prophet in the New Testament. We can see these things together. We can see what Jesus said himself. We can read all these things that the writers of the New Testament said, compare them, lay them side by side with the Old Testament, see it all mapped out in front of us. Spend time with God and he'll show you that map and how clear it is and how easy it is to follow. Because Jesus simply said, come to me, all you who are burdened. I'll give you rest. Come to me. Pick up your cross and follow me. It's simple as that. Just follow me. Walk with me. That's all you need, is just to walk with me. But this is also waiting. Jesus is the door, and God's going to close that door when he sends his son back again. And every one of us knows someone. Every one of us knows somebody who has not yet walked through that door. Every one of us knows someone who's teetering on the edge and playing with it and never faithfully walking with it. Someone who has, he may even claim, oh, I'm a Christian, but is not faithfully walking in that. And Jesus said, there will come a day when many will say, Lord, Lord, and I'll say, I never knew you. We haven't ever taken a walk together. Who are you? You might have seen me from a distance, but you never spent your time with me. We all know those people. They may be family, friends, neighbors, children, grandchildren, parents. We all know people like that. And folks, that door is going to close on them. And part of our faithful walk, part of our job here on this earth is to keep telling people about that and sharing that with them. Maybe it's planting seeds. Maybe it's just watering seeds. There are a lot of seeds out there that sprouted and nobody tended them after they were sprouted. There's a lot of people out there that heard the beginning, but they haven't committed enough to do the end. Maybe that's what your job is to do. How deep is your faith? Let's pray.